He sits in the corner of a dimly lit hotel suite, a glass of scotch untouched at his side, watching the world move with the same calm intensity that once made entire cities bow to his will. There is no shouting, no furious demands, no theatrical display of violence. Instead, there is a silence, heavy, calculating, and deliberate. This is the world of Lucky Luciano, a man who mastered the rarest form of power, the power that doesn't need to announce itself. In an age when the Mafia's fiercest men built their reputations on fear and blood, he built his empire on something far more unsettling: quiet control. To understand how he ruled, you must first understand what he truly represented. He was not just a gangster. He was a reformer of the criminal world, a strategist who replaced the chaotic brutality of the early Mafia with an organized, businesslike system that reshaped American crime forever. And yet, what made him unforgettable wasn't the violence he sanctioned. It was the calmness with which he sanctioned it. Unlike the mob bosses who came before him, Luciano never needed to raise his voice to make a command feel like destiny. His silence spoke louder than threats, and his understated demeanor concealed a mind that was always 5 moves ahead. Imagine walking into a room where every man is armed, every ego is sharpened, and every betrayal is potentially fatal. In such a world, most leaders assert dominance through intimidation. Luciano did the opposite. He listened, observed, calculated. And in that stillness, people revealed everything he needed to know, about their loyalties, their fears, and their weaknesses. His greatest weapon wasn't the gun or the knife, it was the ability to read a man's soul in the way he spoke, or didn't speak. His rise to power wasn't a story of brute force. It was a story of a young immigrant who learned early that survival demanded intelligence as much as courage. Coming from the harsh streets of New York, he understood chaos intimately, but he also understood opportunity. He watched as older Mafia families clung stubbornly to outdated Sicilian traditions, tearing each other apart in endless wars for control. And in the midst of that violence, he envisioned a different future. A streamlined, unified criminal network that operated like a corporation rather than a tribal feud. Before the world knew his name, before newspapers painted him as the puppet master of organized crime, Lucky Luciano had already begun shaping a new kind of power. One rooted in strategy, alliances, and psychological mastery. But despite all his influence, what fascinated people most was the paradox at the heart of his personality. A leader feared by thousands, yet almost never seen raising his voice. A man surrounded by brutality, yet always appearing composed. Someone who built an empire in the shadows, yet could walk into any room and instantly command the atmosphere. This story is not just about the crimes he committed or the empire he forged. It is about the mind behind the myth, the man who understood that fear is loud but power, real power, is quiet. It is about how Charles Lucky Luciano became the architect of the American Mafia, not through terror, but through an unshakable, unnerving calm that made him unlike any mob boss who came before or after him. And as his story unfolds, you will see why men followed him without question, why enemies hesitated before moving against him, and why history remembers him not just as a gangster, but as a strategist of extraordinary brilliance. His legacy is carved not in the gunshots that echoed through the streets, but in the silence that followed them. Before Lucky Luciano emerged as a force capable of reshaping the criminal underworld, America's Mafia existed in a state of raw, unpredictable chaos. The streets of New York were carved into territories by men who carried the old world on their shoulders, rigid traditions, ancient grudges, and an unbreakable belief in blood over reason. Every block was a battlefield. Every handshake carried the weight of betrayal. Violence wasn't a tool, it was a language spoken loudly and often. And in this unstable landscape, the idea of a unified criminal empire was nothing more than a fantasy whispered by men too naive to survive. The early Mafia in America was not the sleek, organized network we often imagine today. It was fragmented into dozens of clans, each led by a boss who answered to no one but his own pride. There were Sicilians who distrusted Neapolitans, Calabrians who despised Sicilians, and newly arrived immigrants who saw America as a place to start fresh conflicts. These divisions created a world where alliances shifted faster than the seasons, and vendettas passed from fathers to sons like inherited curses. A single insult could ignite a war, a minor territorial dispute could turn neighborhoods into battlegrounds. In the shadows of tenements and alleyways, the Mafia acted less like a coherent organization and more like a collection of medieval warlords. Brutality determined rank. Survival depended on instinct. Bosses ruled by fear, not respect. Men followed orders because disobedience meant immediate death, not because they believed in a vision or hierarchy. And while bloodshed established dominance, it also weakened everyone. The police cracked down harder. Politicians distanced themselves. Public outrage grew. The chaos was unsustainable, and yet no one seemed capable of changing it. The early 20th century plunged the underworld into an even darker frenzy. Prohibition, intended to cleanse the country of alcohol, instead flooded the streets with opportunity and conflict. Illegal liquor became the new gold rush, and every family wanted a piece of it. Trucks carrying bootleg whiskey roared through city streets. Secret breweries pumped out profits faster than they could be counted. But with opportunity came war. Families sabotaged each other's shipments, murdered suppliers, bribed the same politicians, and fought over distribution routes as if they were ancient kingdoms defending sacred land. For the ordinary citizen, the Mafia was a distant rumor unless violence spilled into the open, which it often did. Newspaper headlines told stories of bodies found in gutters, shootouts erupting near crowded streets, kidnappings disguised as business negotiations. The public viewed the Mafia as a brutish, incomprehensible force, driven by barbaric traditions. But to those inside the underworld, the chaos was even worse. It was inefficient, wasteful, and dangerously short-sighted. Yet in this turmoil, patterns began to reveal themselves. A small group of younger, more ambitious gangsters recognized the problem. The old ways simply no longer worked. America wasn't Sicily. There was room for expansion, cooperation, industry, if only someone could tame the infighting. But such ideas were radical at the time. The older bosses were too attached to tradition and too threatened by change to consider a new structure. It was in this volatile chapter of history that Lucky Luciano began observing the world he would one day transform. As a young man navigating the streets, he noticed something others overlooked. The Mafia wasn't failing because it was criminal. It was failing because it wasn't organized. Its leaders were warriors, not strategists. They fought for survival, not for stability. Luciano saw himself as part of a new generation. Men who were American enough to understand opportunity, yet Sicilian enough to understand loyalty. This was the world he inherited, a battlefield disguised as an organization. A landscape ruled by noise, fear, and ego. A system too stubborn to evolve. And it was precisely this dysfunction that created the opening for a man like Luciano. A man who believed that power didn't need to be loud, that influence could be built on cooperation as much as intimidation, and that the future belonged not to the men who shouted the loudest but to those who understood how to control the silence. Before he ever seized power, he understood this simple truth. The underworld was on the brink of collapse. Someone needed to impose structure. Someone needed to bring order. Someone needed to rethink what the Mafia could be. And in the darkness of a chaotic era, one young man silently prepared to do exactly that. Long before Lucky Luciano became a name whispered with both fear and respect, he was just another boy stepping off a crowded ship into the chaotic promise of New York City. The year was 1906, and the Luciano family, poor, exhausted, and hopeful, arrived in America carrying little more than their dreams. But for young Salvatore Lucania, the city didn't feel like a land of opportunity. It felt like another battlefield, louder and harsher than the one he had left behind in Sicily. The streets weren't paved with gold. They were paved with danger, discrimination, and the unforgiving reality of survival. He grew up in the slums of the Lower East Side, where poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a constant teacher. Crowded tenements, overflowing garbage, and neighborhoods split by ethnic tension created an environment where children grew up fast or didn't grow up at all. Every corner introduced a new rule of street life. You learned when to fight, when to run, and when to keep your head down. But even as a boy, Luciano had something many others lacked: an instinct for understanding people. He could sense fear, ambition, and resentment long before anyone said a word. It wasn't book-smart intelligence. It was survival intuition honed to perfection. School held no interest for him. Not because he lacked ability but because the streets offered lessons far more valuable. He learned English quickly, not because he wanted to fit in but because he understood that language was power. If you could speak like the Americans, you could negotiate, threaten, charm, and deceive them. And Luciano was already learning how to do all four. By the age of 10, he had formed a small crew of boys who looked to him for direction. Not because he was the strongest but because he seemed to know what to do when everyone else felt lost. His first taste of power came quietly, the way most things in his life did. He began charging neighborhood kids for protection on their walks to school. To adults it looked like petty bullying, but to Luciano it was structure. A system where money, fear, and respect flowed in predictable ways. And unlike other boys who relied on brute strength, he structured his little operation like a business. He offered incentives. He negotiated. He understood motivation. Even then, he was practicing the psychology of leadership. As a teenager, he spent his nights wandering the saloons, gambling houses, and back alleys of the Lower East Side. This wasn't reckless curiosity, it was an education. He was studying the hierarchy of the underworld: dealers, pimps, thieves, small-time gang bosses, all of them part of a maze he planned to navigate. He learned who paid who hated who, and who feared who. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was preparing. It was during these years that he met men who would shape the rest of his life. Meyer Lansky, the quiet mathematical genius; Bugsy Siegel, a fearless force of nature; and other ambitious young outlaws who didn't fit into the old-world mafia mold. They weren't bound by Sicilian tradition or ancient grudges. They were Americanized, driven, and dangerously forward-thinking. Luciano saw in them what he saw in himself: a hunger for power that didn't rely on senseless violence. Yet even as he climbed the ranks of street gangs and small criminal operations, Luciano carried something deeper within him: a desire to transform the very world he was entering. While others fought over scraps, he imagined systems. While others demanded respect, he cultivated influence. And while others raged with emotion, he mastered the art of staying calm, watching, waiting. His rise was not without scars. The infamous beating that left his face permanently slashed, a reminder of the dangers of his chosen path, did more than change his appearance. It created the Lucky persona, the man who survived what should have killed him, the man who learned that fear can be controlled, softened, or redirected if you understand its roots. That moment didn't make him weak. It made him unshakable. Every hardship, every betrayal, every fight on those harsh New York streets shaped him into a leader who understood both sides of power: the desperation of the powerless and the confidence of the powerful. And as he crossed from petty crime into organized networks, he did so with a clarity rare among men his age. He wasn't chasing quick money or temporary dominance. He was building toward something far bigger. In the crowded alleys of his youth, amid hunger, violence, and constant uncertainty, Luciano discovered who he truly was. Not a follower. Not a soldier. But a strategist. A future architect of an empire. A man who would redefine crime in America by focusing not on noise, but on precision. A street kid, yes, but one born to rule. By the time Lucky Luciano entered his 20s, the streets that had taught him survival were no longer enough. He was thinking bigger, far bigger, than any of the men around him. While rival gangs fought over neighborhoods and petty profits, Luciano watched the entire underworld as if it were a disorganized machine waiting for someone bold enough to rewire it. He understood something fundamental. Power didn't belong to the strongest man or even the most feared. It belonged to the one who could bring order where everyone else saw chaos. And that realization became the foundation of the empire he would soon build. The old mafia families operated like feudal kingdoms. Every boss dictated his own rules, every crew enforced tradition with stubborn loyalty, and every dispute ended in blood. But Luciano saw inefficiency everywhere: too much pride, too much unpredictable violence, too much waste. He believed crime could be profitable, structured, and sustainable if only someone treated it like a real business. He wasn't trying to preserve the past. He was trying to invent a future. His first step was strategic alliances. Luciano didn't care about ethnic boundaries or ancient grudges. He partnered with Jewish gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Italian Americans like Frank Costello, and even Irish criminals when opportunity aligned. These alliances weren't acts of rebellion, they were acts of evolution. Luciano saw value where old bosses saw betrayal, and in doing so, he crafted a network that cut across traditional barriers. He formed relationships based on profit, not ethnicity, an unheard-of concept in his time. But alliances alone couldn't transform the underworld. Luciano needed structure. Something that would replace the outdated single-boss system that had plunged the mafia into endless wars. His vision crystallized during the violent conflict known as the Castellamarese War, a power struggle tearing apart the Italian-American underworld. While older bosses fought like generals defending dying empires, Luciano played the conflict like a chess match. He positioned himself carefully, never revealing the full extent of his ambition, and waited for the perfect moment to reshape everything. When he finally acted, it was with precision. The elimination of Joe Masuria and later Salvatore Maranzano wasn't just about survival, it was about clearing the path for an entirely new system. Luciano dismantled the idea of a supreme boss of bosses, a title that bred paranoia and assassination. Instead, he created the Commission, a governing body where leaders from major families shared power, settled disputes and defined rules collectively. It was revolutionary. No more wars over succession, no more unpredictable chaos. The underworld now had a board of directors. This new structure wasn't just about preventing conflict, it was about maximizing profits. Luciano broke the Mafia's operations into departments: gambling, narcotics, extortion, prostitution, labor racketeering, each managed by trusted lieutenants who reported back to him. He didn't micromanage, he delegated. He empowered. He created a chain of command that allowed the organization to function whether he was present or not. And in doing so, he achieved something rare in the criminal world: stability. Luciano's genius wasn't in inventing crime. Crime had existed long before him and would continue long after. His genius was in organizing it, professionalizing it, and turning countless small-time hustlers into the cogs of a massive, efficient machine. He understood that a successful empire needed predictable income, cooperation between families, and a system that rewarded loyalty without relying solely on fear. He replaced the impulsive brutality of the old bosses with calculated strategy. A murder wasn't carried out because someone felt insulted. It happened because it made sense within the structure he built. Despite the bloodshed associated with his rise, Luciano wasn't driven by emotion. He treated violence as an unpleasant but necessary tool, never the first option, always the last. And because of this controlled mindset, he gained something other bosses never truly had: respect rooted in admiration, not just fear. When men spoke of Luciano, they didn't just acknowledge his authority, they acknowledged his vision. He had transformed a chaotic network of feuding criminals into a unified, disciplined enterprise. He had introduced a modern system that allowed organized crime to grow like a corporation, expanding from New York to Chicago, Miami, and beyond. And most importantly, he had achieved what few could even imagine. He ruled the underworld without needing to scream, threaten, or constantly prove himself. His power flowed naturally, quietly, because he built the system through which all power had to move. In those early years of constructing his empire, Luciano revealed the core of who he truly was: not just a gangster rising through the ranks, but an architect shaping an entire world from behind the scenes. Every decision he made, every alliance he forged, every structure he introduced was part of a grand design that would outlive him by decades. He understood people. He understood profit. And he understood that the future belonged to those who could see beyond violence and into the heart of control itself. He wasn't merely building an empire. He was redefining what it meant to rule. Silence has always been a part of the Mafia's identity, but in the hands of Lucky Luciano, it became something far more powerful: an invisible weapon, a binding force, a psychological tool that shaped the soul of his empire. The Code of Omerta had existed long before Luciano was born in the hills of Sicily, where distrust of authority ran deep and loyalty was valued more than life itself. But in America, this ancient code was fragile. Too many men brought old grudges, impulsive emotions, and personal vendettas into a world that demanded something more disciplined. Luciano understood this better than anyone. He realized that silence wasn't just a rule, it was the foundation upon which control could be built. To him, Omerta was not merely about refusing to talk to the police. It was about creating a culture where secrecy became instinct, where loyalty became reflex, and where fear was woven quietly into everyday life. Men followed the code not because they were threatened into it, but because Luciano made them feel part of something larger, something organized, something worth protecting. The old Mafia forced silence through intimidation. Luciano created silence through structure. In this new system, speaking out wasn't just betrayal, it was an act that endangered the entire machine he had built. He knew that human beings could be unpredictable, emotional, even foolish. So he created an environment where breaking Omerta was psychologically unthinkable. Conversations were brief. Meetings were coded. Messages were delivered indirectly, sometimes with nothing more than a gesture or a look. Luciano believed that the less you said, the harder it was for your words to be twisted, overheard, or used against you. He mastered the art of speaking just enough to be understood, and no more. In this world of calculated quiet, Luciano himself became the embodiment of the code. He rarely made threats, but when he did, they were delivered in calm, measured tones that landed harder than any shouted warning. Men trembled not because he yelled, but because he didn't need to. His presence alone seemed to command silence. When he walked into a room, conversations softened, eyes sharpened, and every man present suddenly became aware of his own words. Luciano's control wasn't enforced, it was absorbed. This psychological environment shaped every part of the Mafia's operations. Associates knew that loose talk could cost them their lives, their families, or their futures. But they also knew that silence elevated them, made them trusted, made them part of Luciano's inner circle. He created an ecosystem where the reward for loyalty was security, money, and a sense of belonging, while the price of betrayal was unspoken but universally understood. Fear didn't need to be shouted when it was embedded into the culture itself. Luciano's deep understanding of omerta also allowed him to predict betrayal long before it happened. He watched how men behaved when they thought no one was looking. He noticed who talked too much, who hesitated at the wrong time, who looked away when asked a simple question. Silence exposed truth in a way words never could. Luciano read silence like others read books. It allowed him to judge character, assess risk, and control the emotional balance of his organization. Even beyond the criminal world, silence became part of his personal philosophy. He believed that power was diminished when flaunted. Real strength was quiet, controlled, and deliberate. He didn't need dramatic speeches or violent spectacles to prove himself. He relied on subtlety, on the quiet confidence that came from knowing every man in the room depended on the system he had built. In Luciano's empire, silence wasn't just a rule of survival. It was a language spoken fluently by everyone under his influence. As the Mafia grew under his leadership, omerta transformed from an old-world tradition into a finely tuned psychological weapon. Luciano used it not just to keep secrets but to shape minds. It created unity where there had once been division, discipline where there had been chaos, and respect where there had been nothing but fear. The code bound men together, not just in crime but in purpose. And for Luciano, that was the true brilliance of omerta. It wasn't about silencing voices. It was about building an empire where silence itself carried meaning. A world where the absence of words communicated loyalty, trust, and unquestionable authority. A world where the man who spoke the least commanded the most. In mastering this code, Luciano didn't just change how the Mafia operated. He changed how it thought. He changed what it valued. He changed what it feared. Silence became the heartbeat of his empire, steady, powerful, and impossible to ignore. By the time Luciano consolidated the families under his new structure, the American underworld was no longer a scattered field of small hustles. Under his guidance, it was evolving into a thriving economy, one powered by shadow industries invisible to the public eye but essential to millions of people who never realized they were feeding the machine. To Luciano, crime wasn't merely about breaking the law. It was about recognizing human desire, exploiting weakness, and filling gaps that the legal world refused to acknowledge. And in those gaps, he built industries, quietly, efficiently, and with a businessman's precision. Gambling was one of the first markets he truly mastered. It had always existed on the fringes of society: backroom card games, illegal betting parlors, rigged dice games, and smoky bars. But under Luciano, gambling became a streamlined, multi-tiered enterprise. He established networks where bookmakers coordinated across states, where profits flowed upward through layers of collectors and enforcers. Every man had a role. Every loss generated revenue. Every payout strengthened the system. And because Luciano treated it like an industry rather than a pastime, gambling transformed from small-time hustling into a reliable, organized profit engine. Prostitution followed the same pattern. Rather than leaving it to independent madams and street-level pimps, Luciano structured a network that ensured consistent income while minimizing risk. He introduced rules, oversight, and protection mechanisms. He placed trusted managers to control brothels, set prices, and ensure safety for the workers, which ironically made his system more humane than many legal industries of the time. He understood the psychology of secrecy, desire, and shame, and he monetized them with uncanny efficiency. Labor racketeering became yet another pillar of Luciano's empire. He realized early that unions held enormous power over industries: docks, trucking, construction, and manufacturing. If you controlled the union leaders, you controlled the flow of goods, the schedules of factories, and the decisions of employers desperate to keep operations running smoothly. Luciano didn't just extort unions, he embedded the Mafia within them. He gained influence over strikes, contracts, and negotiations, turning the labor movement into a silent partner of the underworld. Companies paid for peace. Workers paid for security. And Luciano extracted profit from both sides while remaining unseen. Then there was narcotics, dangerous, profitable, and deeply controversial. Even within the Mafia, many old bosses feared the drug trade would bring too much heat. But Luciano wasn't naive. He understood risk, but he also understood demand. Drugs were a growing market with unparalleled revenue potential. He approached narcotics the way he approached everything: systematically. He created international supply routes, distribution networks, and safety buffers that kept top bosses insulated from street-level arrests. By treating narcotics as a controlled, business-like operation, Luciano turned what others saw as reckless into one of the most profitable arms of the criminal economy. Behind each industry he built lay the same principle: efficiency. Luciano believed an organization should run smoothly whether he was present or not. He surrounded himself with capable men: Costello handling politics, Lansky managing finances, Siegel dealing with expansion into Las Vegas. Luciano delegated control but kept oversight. He was the silent architect, the unseen gravitational force that held everything together. His empire did not rely on constant violence or fear. It relied on structure. What made his approach so groundbreaking was the way he blurred the line between crime and business. Meetings were conducted like board conferences. Profits were tracked meticulously. Investments were strategic. Men in tailored suits discussed illegal enterprises with the same seriousness as Wall Street bankers planning their next move. Luciano professionalized the underworld in a way no one had before, turning gangsters into businessmen and rackets into industries. Yet, beneath the smooth operations there was a darker truth. Every business Luciano built was rooted in exploitation. People gambled because they were desperate to change their luck. Immigrants joined unions because they needed protection. Women entered prostitution because they lacked options. Addicts bought narcotics because they were trapped in cycles they couldn't escape. Luciano never created demand, he simply capitalized on human vulnerability. And that was his brilliance. He didn't rely on brute force. He relied on understanding human nature. He predicted needs before people voiced them, recognized weaknesses before others noticed, and built systems that fed off the quiet desires society tried to hide. He didn't invent these industries, he perfected them. He polished their edges, organized their structures, and turned them into dependable financial machines. As his empire expanded, Luciano became less of a traditional mobster and more of a silent businessman operating in the shadows of America's booming economy. He built an underground world that was every bit as complex, interconnected, and powerful as the legitimate industries above it. And all of it operated with one guiding philosophy: control doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be efficient. Luciano's business empire was not made of buildings or corporations. It was made of people, desire, fear, and silence. And through this intricate web, he controlled more of the American underground than any man before him, quietly, deliberately, and with a level of strategic brilliance that made him unforgettable. Power is never held alone. Even the most brilliant strategist requires allies. Men who can amplify his strengths and shield his weaknesses. And yet, in the world Lucky Luciano inhabited, every ally carried the potential to become an enemy, and every enemy possessed the ability to become useful. The underworld was a place where loyalty had an expiration date, where friendships were measured not in affection but in advantage, and where the quietest man in the room often understood everyone better than they understood themselves. Luciano navigated these relationships with an instinct that bordered on supernatural, always knowing who to embrace, who to manipulate, and who to eliminate. Among the men closest to him was Meyer Lansky, the soft-spoken mathematical prodigy who became Luciano's strategic mirror. Where Luciano read faces and emotions, Lansky read ledgers and probabilities. The two shared a bond deeper than crime. They shared vision. They knew the future wasn't in petty street wars but in organized profit. Lansky's calm intelligence complemented Luciano's controlled charisma, creating a partnership that would become the backbone of modern organized crime. Their alliance was built not on ethnicity or tradition, but on mutual respect, and that alone made them revolutionary. Then there was Bugsy Siegel, a man whose temper could ignite a room faster than a lit match. Siegel was volatile, fearless, unpredictable, the opposite of Luciano in almost every way. And yet he was indispensable. While Luciano worked through strategy and silence, Siegel executed the dangerous tasks that required speed, aggression, and unwavering loyalty. He was Luciano's sword, sharp, dangerous, and occasionally uncontrollable. Luciano knew Siegel might someday become a problem, but he also understood that great empires are built not only on stability, but on the boldness of men willing to take risks others feared. Siegel embodied that boldness, and Luciano knew exactly how to channel it. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, offered something even more valuable: political influence. Costello had a talent that few mobsters possessed: the ability to speak the language of powerful men in expensive suits. He could sit with judges, union leaders, and senators, and make them forget they were dealing with a criminal. He opened doors that guns could never open and created alliances that lasted for decades. Luciano considered him indispensable not for violence but for diplomacy. And in Luciano's world, diplomacy could be deadlier than any bullet. But power is defined not only by the allies one keeps, but by the enemies one overcomes. And Luciano faced enemies who were as cunning and ruthless as he was. Joe, the boss Masuria, was one of the first. A man anchored in old Sicilian customs, Masuria ruled through intimidation and paranoia, refusing to adapt to the changing world. To him, Luciano's alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters were unforgivable betrayals. But Luciano saw the future and Masuria belonged to the past. Their relationship became a quiet, dangerous dance of suspicion until the day Luciano orchestrated Masuria's assassination, a move that signaled the beginning of a new era. Then came Salvatore Maranzano, the last great obstacle. Intelligent, disciplined, and deeply traditional, Maranzano saw himself as a Caesar of the underworld. He admired Luciano's ambition but feared his independence. The two men worked together briefly after the Castellamarese War, but tension simmered beneath every agreement. Maranzano despised the idea of shared power. Luciano despised the idea of bowing to anyone. Their alliance was doomed from the start. And when Maranzano plotted Luciano's murder, Luciano struck first, quietly, decisively, and without hesitation. With Maranzano gone, Luciano finally stood at the top. Yet Luciano's greatest strength was not in eliminating rivals but in understanding the psychology behind every man he dealt with. He knew which buttons to press, when to show respect, when to intimidate subtly, and when to let time weaken an opponent. He studied people with the same intensity others studied maps or business plans. He could sense fear in a man's hesitation, ambition in his eyes, betrayal in the cadence of his voice. And with that knowledge he shaped alliances not through fear, but through design. But the underworld remained unpredictable. Some men followed Luciano because they admired him. Others followed because they feared the consequences of not doing so. Some saw him as a modern leader. Others viewed him as the destroyer of old traditions. Even within his circle, ambitions simmered silently. Men like Vito Genovese watched Luciano's every move, waiting for an opening, pretending loyalty while nurturing hunger for power. Luciano understood this, but he also understood something more important. An empire is never built by eliminating all threats. It is built by knowing which threats can be controlled and which must be removed. Through it all, Lucky Luciano's leadership remained a study in contrast. He cultivated the loyalty of brilliant minds like Lansky and Costello, while neutralizing the dangers presented by men like Masuria and Maranzano. He understood that a leader who tries to rule through fear alone eventually becomes a prisoner of his own paranoia. Luciano chose a different path. He ruled through balance, reward and punishment, trust and caution, silence and strategy. And in that delicate balance, he built something unprecedented. A criminal empire where alliances were not just tools, but the very architecture of power itself. His enemies forced him to sharpen his instincts. His allies allowed him to expand his vision. Together, they shaped the man who would become the most influential gangster of modern history, because he knew how to use people without ever letting them feel used. In a world where betrayal lurked behind every handshake, Luciano's mastery lay in understanding that control was not about dominating others loudly. It was about guiding them quietly, until the entire underworld moved in rhythm with his will. As Luciano's empire expanded and stabilized, a new kind of war began to engulf the underworld, a quiet, relentless struggle fought not on the streets alone, but in the shadows where law enforcement, political pressure, and internal rivalries collided. This was a war without battlefields, without front lines, without the dramatic bursts of violence that defined earlier Mafia conflicts. It was a hidden war, one built on surveillance, suspicion, informants, double dealings, and a silent tightening of the noose around the criminal world. And Luciano, for all his brilliance, found himself navigating dangers that could not be solved with a gun or a strategic alliance alone. The federal government had grown increasingly aware that the Mafia was no longer a disorganized cluster of street gangs. Luciano's structured empire, ironically, made detection easier. Patterns emerged. Money flowed predictably. Networks expanded across state lines. The FBI, state prosecutors, and ambitious district attorneys began to see the outlines of something much larger than isolated crimes. To them, Luciano wasn't just another mobster. He was the architect of a national criminal infrastructure. And that realization changed everything. Law enforcement developed new methods to track criminal activity. They infiltrated unions, listened to whispers on docks, monitored illegal gambling houses, and planted undercover agents in places where no cop had ever dared to go before. They studied the patterns of bootlegging, followed the money trails, and assembled dossiers thicker than phone books. The authorities no longer needed to catch Luciano with a weapon in his hand. They only needed to prove that he commanded the chaos around him. As pressure mounted from the outside, tension simmered within. The commission Luciano built, designed to prevent internal wars, functioned smoothly on the surface. But beneath that polished structure, old resentments still flickered like embers waiting for oxygen. Rival families watched one another closely for signs of weakness. Power imbalances shifted quietly as new opportunities appeared. Men who once depended on Luciano's leadership grew ambitious, confident enough to imagine a world where they no longer needed him. Vito Genovese, in particular, kept a close eye on everything Luciano did. He understood Luciano's brilliance, admired his strategies, but resented his position. Genovese saw himself as the rightful heir to greater power. He was patient, calculating, and bold enough to consider betraying the very system that had made him wealthy. Luciano knew it. He sensed the hunger in Genovese's silence, the restless ambition lurking beneath his outward obedience. But Luciano also knew that removing Genovese too soon could fracture the delicate balance of the families. So he watched. And waited. Meanwhile, federal agents worked tirelessly to penetrate the underworld's shield of omerta. They pressured low-level associates, bribed union officials, threatened workers with deportation, and exploited anyone who showed a moment of fear. While the top bosses remained insulated, the cracks formed at the bottom, among the desperate men who had more loyalty to their families than to the Mafia. The authorities didn't need to topple Luciano directly. They only needed one frightened man willing to speak. This was the hidden war Luciano feared most, not because he doubted his ability to outmaneuver opponents, but because he understood the unpredictable nature of human weakness. Guns could be silenced. Rivals could be eliminated. But fear, once planted by law enforcement, spread like an infection. It could turn a trusted associate into a liability overnight. It could transform a loyal soldier into an informant with a single whispered threat. The government also began weaponizing public opinion. Newspapers ran sensational headlines painting Luciano as a shadow king manipulating every corner of American vice. Politicians gave speeches condemning organized crime, promising harsh legislation and aggressive prosecution. Public pressure mounted. The courts no longer needed perfect evidence. They needed a victory. And Luciano, despite his efforts to stay out of the spotlight, became the face of a criminal world the government desperately wanted to bring down. Inside the underworld, Luciano responded with his usual calm. He shifted operations, tightened communication protocols, and assigned trusted lieutenants to quietly neutralize risks. He diminished his own visibility, letting Costello handle political maneuvering and Lansky manage finances. Luciano understood that in a war fought in the shadows, the loudest man dies first. So he became quieter than ever, moving like a ghost through the criminal networks he built. But no matter how carefully he moved, the forces gathering against him were relentless. The hidden war was not a single threat, it was a convergence of many: government determination, internal ambition, shifting alliances, informants looking for deals, and a public demanding justice. It was a storm building silently around him, each gust of pressure eroding the untouchable image he had cultivated. Luciano had survived street wars, assassination attempts, and betrayals. But this new era tested something deeper: his ability to maintain control in a world where the enemy didn't announce itself. This war wasn't fought with bullets. It was fought with investigations, subpoenas, secret testimony, and political pressure. And in that new battlefield, every whisper mattered, every alliance was suspect, and every misstep could end an empire built through years of quiet strategy. As the hidden war intensified, one truth became impossible to ignore: even the most powerful man in the underworld could not remain invisible forever. The shadows that once protected Luciano were beginning to reveal him. And soon, the man who ruled without fear would find himself facing a world determined to expose everything he had built. The fall of a king never begins with a single moment. It begins with small cracks, hairline fractures beneath the surface that grow quietly, invisibly, until the world shifts under his feet. For Lucky Luciano, the man who built an empire on silence, strategy, and composure, the beginning of the end arrived not with a gunshot or betrayal in a dark alley, but with something far more dangerous: attention. The kind of attention powerful men can evade for years, until suddenly they cannot. By the mid-1930s, prosecutors, investigators, and the press had woven Luciano's name into a symbol, an embodiment of America's criminal underworld. He had tried to remain a shadow, but the empire he built was too large, too organized, too profitable to remain invisible. It stretched across cities, industries, unions, and vice markets. And the more efficient it grew, the more visible its architect became. Quiet control had protected him for years, but now the authorities weren't simply chasing criminals, they were hunting the man they believed controlled them all. What made Luciano vulnerable wasn't arrogance. It wasn't carelessness. It was a shift in the political winds. District Attorney Thomas Dewey, ambitious and relentless, decided that breaking Luciano would launch his own career into the national spotlight. To Dewey, Luciano wasn't a man, he was a target. A headline. A trophy. And once Dewey fixed his eyes on that target, he pursued it with a determination that even Luciano had underestimated. The vice raids began quietly. Police stormed brothels, gambling houses, and nightclubs across New York. At first, Luciano barely paid attention. Raids happened. Arrests happened. Nothing new. But this time the raids were coordinated. Systematic. And the men being arrested all pointed in the same direction. The prosecutors weren't just gathering bodies, they were gathering testimony. They weren't trying to dismantle prostitution or gambling, they were building a case, brick by brick, aimed solely at Luciano. Soon, whispers began circulating through the underworld. Detectives were offering deals. Prosecutors were threatening deportation. Low-level workers, terrified and desperate, began cooperating. Women from the brothels provided statements. Union members testified. Street-level operators betrayed secrets they barely understood. Even those who had never met Luciano were suddenly naming him as the man behind everything, simply because it reduced their own prison time. Rumors reached Luciano quickly. He heard the panic in the voices of men who came to him for guidance. He sensed the shift in tone, the uneasy hesitation in the room when men spoke about the raids. He felt the air tighten around him as though the walls were quietly closing in. But he remained calm. He had faced danger before, real danger, the kind that came with gun barrels and ambushes. This new threat felt different, but Luciano refused to show fear. Yet deep inside he recognized something alarming. This wasn't a war he could fight with the tools he understood. You couldn't intimidate a grand jury. You couldn't bribe every judge. You couldn't silence every witness. The law didn't move like the streets, it was slow, patient, tireless. And Dewey had the one weapon Luciano could never fully neutralize: the public. The newspapers portrayed Luciano as a monster, a man who controlled thousands of prostitutes, terrorized neighborhoods, and corrupted the very soul of New York. Headlines screamed his name daily. Politicians demanded justice. Citizens called for punishment. The climate had changed, and in that new climate, Luciano's quiet control was beginning to buckle. Still, he continued conducting business. He traveled. He met associates. He reassured his inner circle with the same composure that had always defined him. But even he knew the momentum had shifted. When detectives finally approached him, they did so with newfound confidence. Not the hesitant respect once reserved for powerful mobsters, but the boldness of men who believed they had already won. Luciano tried to maintain his routine, but the surveillance grew heavier. Every movement was tracked. Every conversation was monitored. Informants whispered in hallways he once considered safe. The hidden war that had been tightening around him now stepped into daylight. Then came the betrayal, the moment every powerful man inevitably faces. Someone within the system, someone who once held silence sacred, provided the testimony prosecutors desperately needed. Whether motivated by fear, desperation, or ambition, that voice opened the door for Dewey to strike. One spring morning in 1936, the inevitable finally arrived. Luciano was arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas, far from the city he controlled. The man who once walked New York streets with untouchable confidence now found himself surrounded by officers who treated him not with fear, but with triumph. His capture wasn't a quiet event. It was a spectacle. Reporters rushed to document the fall of the Lord of the Underworld. Dewey smiled for the cameras. And Luciano, in that moment, realized that power, even quiet power, could not protect a man forever. He was extradited to New York, paraded through the legal system like a trophy, and placed in a cell that felt colder than anything he had ever known. For the first time in years, the man who ruled without fear felt the faint, unsettling echo of vulnerability. It wasn't defeat yet, but it was the unmistakable beginning of the end. When the trial of Lucky Luciano began, it was more than a legal proceeding, it was a public spectacle, a performance staged for a nation hungry for justice and drama. Courtroom benches overflowed with reporters, spectators, and political figures who understood that this trial was not just about one man, but about the government's attempt to shatter the myth of organized crime. The atmosphere was electric, thick with anticipation, as if everyone sensed they were witnessing the unraveling of an empire. Luciano entered the courtroom wearing the same quiet confidence he had carried throughout his rise, but beneath that calm exterior lay a storm of calculations. He scanned the room the way a general studies the battlefield. He recognized the determined glint in Thomas Dewey's eyes, the young prosecutor who had built his career on exposing corruption and who now saw Luciano as his crowning victory. Dewey's posture radiated certainty, as though the verdict had already been written. The charges were severe: compulsory prostitution, running a massive vice network, manipulating thousands of women, and coordinating operations across the city. It was a web of accusations designed not only to convict him, but to portray him as the puppet master of every immoral act in New York's nightlife. Luciano had never seen himself that way. He saw himself as a businessman, a strategist, someone who built systems. But the prosecutors were constructing a different narrative, one intended to strip him of any aura of sophistication and reduce him to a monster in the eyes of the jury. Witnesses took the stand one after another. Many were women who had worked in brothels, some coerced, some frightened, some eager to escape their own charges. Their stories were vivid, emotional, and often inconsistent. Yet Dewey used their testimonies skillfully, weaving fragments into a convincing tapestry of guilt. He didn't need perfect coherence, he needed impact. An impact he delivered. The courtroom gasped at the descriptions of brutality, control, and exploitation. Even those who doubted Luciano's direct involvement found themselves unsettled by the rawness of the stories. The media seized on every word, painting Luciano as the mastermind behind a vice empire. Headlines were sensational, dramatic, and often exaggerated. Each morning, newspapers fueled public outrage, turning opinion firmly against him before he even arrived in court. Luciano remained composed throughout, listening intently, rarely reacting. He knew that any sign of anger could be interpreted as guilt. Any display of coldness could be called arrogance. And any attempt to defend himself loudly could be twisted against him. So he sat quietly as he had always ruled, through controlled silence. But silently, a truth gnawed at him. This battlefield did not play by the rules he understood. Influence, alliances, and strategy meant little here. The outcome depended not on logic but on perception. His defense attempted to undermine the credibility of witnesses, highlighting contradictions and motivations for lying. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence connecting Luciano directly to the prostitution networks. They argued that he was targeted simply because he was a symbol, because the government needed a figurehead to destroy. But the tide of public opinion had already tilted. The courtroom had become a stage for morality, not truth. And Luciano felt the weight of that shift with every passing day. Throughout the trial, he watched Dewey with a mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. Dewey was relentless, disciplined, and utterly focused. He didn't fear Luciano. He didn't negotiate. He didn't hesitate. He treated Luciano not as a dangerous adversary, but as an obstacle to his own political ascent, an obstacle he fully intended to crush. And in that certainty, Luciano glimpsed something familiar: ambition, the very force that had driven his own rise. As closing arguments drew near, the tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. Dewey painted Luciano as a social menace, a man whose empire thrived on the suffering of women. He spoke with fire, confidence, and conviction. Every word struck like a hammer. When the defense offered their final plea, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and manipulated, their words felt small compared to Dewey's thunder. Then came the waiting. Hours stretched into a suffocating silence. Jurors deliberated behind closed doors while Luciano sat in a holding room, pondering the fragility of the empire he once controlled with such ease. For the first time he could not read the outcome. He could not sway it. He could not maneuver around it. When the jury returned, the room fell into a hush. The verdict was announced with a cold finality that cut deeper than any knife: guilty on all counts. Luciano absorbed the words without flinching, but inside, something shifted, an acknowledgement that the world he had built was no longer under his command. The sentence was staggering: 30 to 50 years in prison. A lifetime for most men. A message to every gangster in America. The courtroom erupted in whispers, gasps, and flashes from reporters' cameras. Dewey's face remained composed, but the triumph in his eyes was unmistakable. He had done what no one else had accomplished, brought the mighty Luciano to his knees. As guards led him away, Luciano walked with steady steps, his face expressionless. But inside he knew this moment was not just a punishment. It was a turning point. The world he shaped would continue without him, for better or worse. And now, for the first time in his life, the master of quiet control would have to confront a reality where silence no longer protected him, where the bars of a cell replaced the shadows he once commanded. It was not the end of his story. But it was the moment his empire began to fracture. Prison has a way of stripping a man down to his most vulnerable self. The concrete walls, the clanging steel doors, the endless cycles of routine, they are designed to break spirit, to reduce identity to nothing more than a number in a ledger. But for Lucky Luciano, confinement became something else entirely. It became a new proving ground, a place where he would test whether the empire he built truly depended on his physical freedom, or whether his influence ran deeper, woven into the very fabric of the underworld he once commanded. When Luciano first arrived at Dannemora, one of the toughest prisons in New York State, the guards expected arrogance. They expected a man accustomed to luxury to crumble under the rough discipline of incarceration. Instead, Luciano carried himself with the same controlled silence that had defined his leadership on the outside. He never complained, never begged, never showed fear. Even behind bars, he understood that perception was power. If the guards sensed weakness, they would exploit it. If inmates sensed fear, they would challenge it. So Luciano presented the same calm, unreadable mask he had worn in boardrooms, backrooms, and commission meetings. Inside, everyone knew who he was. Some inmates admired him, others despised him, but none underestimated him. Even the guards watched him closely, some with curiosity, others with suspicion. It was as if the myth of Lucky Luciano had entered prison before he did, carrying a reputation that clung to him like a shadow. But reputation alone wasn't enough. Luciano had to rebuild control in a place where he couldn't offer money or protection the way he once had. So he relied on something deeper: respect. He treated the guards with unexpected politeness. He spoke to fellow inmates with quiet dignity. He never acted superior, never flaunted his past, never tried to intimidate. This humility disarmed people. It made them talk to him, made them trust him. Within months, Luciano had established a quiet influence. Men sought his advice, his approval, his insight. Guards, though cautious, began to view him as a stabilizing presence rather than a threat. His silence, once a weapon in the underworld, became a shield behind bars. And yet, despite the restrictions, Luciano remained connected to the world beyond the prison walls. Letters coded in subtle language traveled through trusted intermediaries. Visitors, lawyers, friends, associates, brought news and transported instructions embedded in the smallest of gestures or the most casual phrases. Luciano never gave direct orders. He didn't need to. His lieutenants understood him so completely that a single expression could dictate an entire course of action. Frank Costello ensured the political ties remained strong. Meyer Lansky oversaw financial operations with his usual precision. Other families continued to respect the system Luciano had built, partly because it served them, and partly because his presence, even in prison, still carried weight. The commission continued to operate as he intended. Turf remained divided. Businesses ran smoothly. Disputes were handled through protocols he created. It was as if his spirit hovered over every meeting, every decision, every handshake. Inside the prison, Luciano worked quietly to improve conditions, not only for himself but for others. He secured better labor assignments, mediated conflicts, and earned privileges through good behavior and subtle negotiation. He wasn't just surviving, he was adapting. Prison became yet another structure for him to understand and manipulate. He studied the routines, the hierarchies, the politics among guards and inmates. Just as he had done on the streets of New York, he learned the system from the inside out. Still, nights were the hardest. When the noise died down and the cold crept in, Luciano felt the weight of the iron bars more intensely. The empire he built had once made him feel untouchable, but now he was reduced to a small cell with a narrow bed and a window that showed nothing but sky. In those lonely hours, he confronted the one enemy he had never been able to silence: time. He wondered whether his empire would outlast him, whether the commission would remain loyal, whether young gangsters eager for power would disrupt the balance he created. He worried about betrayal, not from the men he trusted most, but from ambition itself, the force that toppled every king eventually. Despite everything, he refused to surrender to despair. Even when illnesses struck, even when the days blurred into routine, even when guards attempted to provoke him, Luciano remained steady. He exercised. He read. He observed. He waited. Prison had not diminished him. It had refined him. His mind grew sharper, his patience deeper, his understanding of human nature even more precise. And slowly the world outside began to shift in his favor. His assistance during World War II, facilitating cooperation between the Navy and the Mafia for port security, created murmurs of political indebtedness. Officials who once condemned him began to consider the strategic value of his connections. From behind bars, Luciano contributed to national defense, an irony that history still struggles to fully grasp. Even locked away, he remained a man whose influence extended beyond walls, beyond laws, beyond the expectations of anyone who believed prison could contain him. The quiet control he mastered on the streets did not fade in confinement. If anything, it grew stronger. Luciano had proven that power wasn't defined by where a man stood, but by how deeply his shadow reached. And even from a cell, his shadow still stretched across America. Exile is a punishment that moves differently from prison. A cell confines the body, but exile confines the soul. It places a man in a world filled with familiar sounds and familiar landscapes, yet strips him of the one thing that gives those memories meaning: a sense of belonging. When Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship into Naples, he felt a void that even he, calm, strategic, composed, could not easily hide. Italy was the land of his birth, the soil of his ancestors, the language of his childhood. But it was no longer home. Home had become New York, the city that transformed a poor immigrant boy into a king of the underworld. And now that city had closed its doors to him forever. He walked through the narrow streets of Naples with the posture of a man who had lost a war no one saw him fighting. The vendors shouting in dialect, the old men playing cards on makeshift tables, the fishermen mending nets by the pier, everything looked familiar, yet emotionally distant. Luciano had lived more years in America than in Italy. He thought like an American, strategized like an American, built empires like an American. Here, in the land of his ancestors, he was a stranger wearing the face of someone expected to remember everything. Still, he adapted as great strategists always do. He found an apartment overlooking the sea, a modest place compared to the penthouses and luxury suites he once frequented, but quiet enough for a man who now lived in reflection. From the balcony, he watched ships drift in and out of the harbor. Sometimes he imagined what it would feel like to be on one of those ships, heading west across the Atlantic. But imagination was all he had. The United States had made its decision. He could help the war effort, he could clean up the docks, he could serve the country in secret operations, but he could never set foot on American soil again. Yet even in exile, Luciano remained influential. The underworld still saw him as the architect of their world. Young mobsters, full of ambition and hunger, traveled across continents just to meet him. Some came seeking advice. Some came seeking approval. Others came simply to say they had stood in the presence of the man who created the commission, who modernized the Mafia, who showed that intelligence could be more lethal than violence. They arrived in Naples cautiously, avoiding authorities, moving through shadows, because to visit Luciano was to admit allegiance to a man whom governments still watched closely. Luciano received them with the same calm, analytical demeanor he had always possessed. He listened more than he spoke. He offered guidance, not commands. He had learned, painfully, that direct control was no longer his. He could no longer dictate policy, settle disputes, or shape the underworld with the same precision as before. But he could still influence. He could still advise. And his words carried weight simply because they were his. But influence from afar is a fragile thing. Luciano watched as the American Mafia changed in ways he never fully approved of. Narcotics trafficking grew rapidly, spreading like wildfire through cities he once controlled. Younger bosses saw heroin and cocaine not as risks but as financial shortcuts. Luciano feared this direction. He knew drugs invited scrutiny, chaos, and betrayal. But his voice, once strong enough to end wars, now echoed through distance and generational shift. Some listened. Most did not. The rise of Vito Genovese frustrated him deeply. Genovese was everything Luciano disliked in a leader. Impulsive, paranoid, domineering. He saw power as a possession, not a responsibility. Luciano had always valued balance, stability over dominance, cooperation over ego. But Genovese believed in ruling through fear, enforcing obedience rather than earning it. From Naples, Luciano watched Genovese maneuver his way into greater influence, manipulating alliances, sowing distrust, and turning men against each other. It was exactly the kind of leadership Luciano had tried to prevent when he built the commission. Still, he did what he could. He sent warnings through intermediaries. He tried to steady the shifting alliances. He encouraged patience where others saw only opportunity. But the Mafia was no longer his design alone. It had evolved into an organism with its own ambitions, desires, and faults. And for the first time, Luciano witnessed the painful truth that haunts all creators. Once your creation becomes powerful enough, it no longer belongs to you. The Havana Conference, one of the last major moments of Luciano's involvement, revived a spark of his old authority. He traveled to Cuba under secrecy, hoping to reclaim influence by presenting himself not as an exiled relic but as a global strategist. And for a moment it worked. He sat at the center of the table, surrounded by powerful men, gambling bosses from Las Vegas, narcotics traffickers from Europe, mafia leaders from New York and Chicago. They listened. They admired. They remembered who he was. But the world had changed too much for him to return permanently. Pressure forced Cuba to expel him. The Havana dream vanished, and Luciano was returned once again to Italy, a reminder that no matter how brilliant he was, exile had become his cage. Time moved differently for him after that. Days passed quietly, marked by routine: morning coffee, afternoon walks through narrow streets, evenings smoking by the balcony. His hair grayed. His posture weakened. His heart, damaged by years of stress, began to falter. Yet through it all, his mind remained sharp. Visitors still remarked that Luciano looked at them as if reading their intentions like open books. Even when his body betrayed him, his intelligence did not. Loneliness, however, crept in like a silent intruder. Many of his old allies were dead or imprisoned. Lansky, though loyal, lived far away and carried his own battles. Costello had retired into a quieter life. Siegel was long gone, murdered in a blaze of bullets that echoed the violent contradictions of the world Luciano created. The new generation of bosses knew his name but not his spirit. They respected the architect but did not understand the philosophy behind his blueprints. Luciano often thought about the irony of it all. He had built a system meant to outlive him, and it had. But the system had grown in directions he never intended: more violent, more reckless, more exposed. The quiet control he valued had been replaced by public displays of power. The careful balance had tipped toward greed. Men who once followed structure now chased chaos. This realization weighed on him heavily. Still, there were moments of peace. Watching the sun set over the Mediterranean gave him a sense of serenity. The waves reminded him of the constant motion of life. Unpredictable, unstoppable, but always moving forward. In those moments he reflected not on crime but on human nature. Why men seek power. Why ambition devours loyalty. Why control brings both stability and destruction. He knew he could not escape the consequences of his choices. He had shaped the underworld and in doing so shaped countless lives, some enriched, many harmed. He carried that awareness with quiet acceptance, never glorifying his past but never condemning it entirely. He saw it as the path he was shaped to walk, formed by childhood poverty, immigrant struggle, and the brutality of early 20th century America. He had navigated a world where options were limited and survival demanded strength, ingenuity, and courage. He did not excuse himself. He understood himself. His death came suddenly yet symbolically. While meeting with a filmmaker interested in telling his story, Luciano collapsed at the Naples airport. The man who controlled narratives, who orchestrated systems from shadows, died just as someone sought to immortalize him. It was poetic, almost theatrical, the final scene of a life shaped by secrecy and spectacle. When news of his death reached America, reactions were mixed. Law enforcement saw it as the end of an era. Old gangsters felt the passing of a legend. Young criminals spoke his name with reverence, as though he were a myth rather than a man. Newspapers revived stories of his empire. Historians began dissecting his influence. And ordinary people, many who never knew his story, sensed that someone significant had left the world. Yet the truth of his end was simple and human. He died far from the streets that made him, alone in a country he never fully reclaimed, carrying memories heavier than any prison sentence could have imposed. His exile did not break him. It revealed him. It showed the world a man stripped of power, yet still defined by the quiet intelligence that guided his rise. And it proved something deeper, that legends do not die with their bodies. They die only when people stop telling their stories. Lucky Luciano's story never stopped being told. Legacy is a strange force. It does not obey the rules of life. It does not fade when a man disappears. It lingers, reshaping itself, adapting to the world that remains after he is gone. For Lucky Luciano, legacy became something far larger and far more enduring than the empire he built or the crimes he committed. His influence seeped into the very architecture of organized crime, into the psychology of leadership, the structure of international syndicates, and even the behavior of modern institutions that, knowingly or unknowingly, borrowed from his methods. In the years after his death, it became clear that Luciano had not merely ruled the underworld, he had redesigned it. The first and most obvious part of his legacy was structural. Before Luciano, the Mafia in America resembled a chaotic constellation of uncoordinated clans, driven by emotion, tradition, and endless rivalry. After Luciano, it resembled a corporation, a system with departments, leadership protocols, and a governing board. The commission he created did not die with him. It continued for decades as the central nervous system of the American Mafia. Disputes between families were settled through discussion rather than open warfare. Territories were respected. Profit-sharing arrangements remained intact. Luciano's emphasis on stability became the backbone of an underworld that grew steadily more powerful and financially sophisticated. But beyond structure there was strategy. Luciano proved that power does not need to be loud or theatrical to be effective. His quiet control, his ability to influence without dominating openly, reshaped the psychology of criminal leadership. He showed that fear was a shallow currency, one that bought loyalty only as long as a man was too frightened to resist. Respect, however, earned through competence, fairness, and consistency, created loyalty that endured. The next generations of mob bosses studied this approach carefully. Men like Carlo Gambino, Joseph Bonanno, and Santo Trafficante adopted Luciano's model. Rule calmly, avoid unnecessary violence, keep your profile low, and let the system, not your ego, do the work. This transformation gave birth to an era in which mafia figures walked the thin line between criminality and legitimate influence. They attended political dinners, owned stakes in casinos and hotels, manipulated union leadership, and controlled industries from the shadows. Luciano may not have lived to witness the mafia's golden age of the 1960s and 70s, but it was his blueprint that made that era possible. His belief in national cooperation, rational decision-making, and corporate organization allowed the underworld to grow beyond anything the old Sicilian model could have achieved. Yet Luciano's legacy extended far beyond the mafia itself. He influenced criminal organizations across the world. The French Connection heroin network borrowed concepts from his international supply routes. Latin American cartels later adopted centralized leadership structures that resembled Luciano's commission concept. Even legitimate corporations, although unknowingly, reflected elements of his organizational philosophy: clear chains of command, decentralized operations, and regional autonomy that still reported to a central authority. Luciano understood systems intuitively, long before modern management theories were written. More subtly, Luciano changed how the world perceived crime. Before him, gangsters were seen as crude, violent men who relied on intimidation alone. After him, the public began to understand that crime could be strategic, intelligent, and disturbingly efficient. He blurred the boundary between businessman and criminal, presenting an image of a refined, calculating figure who operated not out of impulse but out of logic. This shift in perception carried dangerous implications. It romanticized the idea of the organized gangster, turning figures like Luciano into antiheroes, men admired for their intelligence even as their actions caused immeasurable harm. Hollywood fed this perception. Gangster films of the 1950s and onward borrowed heavily from Luciano's story. Characters like Michael Corleone in The Godfather, though fictional, embodied Luciano's calm decisiveness, strategic mind, and quiet authority. Crime dramas, documentaries, and novels built narratives around leaders who used intellect over brute force, diplomacy over bloodshed. Luciano became a mythic archetype, a symbol of the modern criminal mastermind. But legacy is not only about admiration. It also demands an honest reckoning. Luciano's brilliance came at a price paid by countless others. The industries he organized, prostitution, gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, brought suffering to thousands of families. His calculated approach eliminated street wars but expanded the scale of criminal operations to a national level. The Mafia, under his guidance, became so deeply rooted in American society that decades of governmental effort were required to dismantle even parts of it. Many of the social and economic problems tied to organized crime, including corruption and drug distribution, trace back to the systems Luciano helped perfect. Even so, his influence is undeniable. When law enforcement agencies studied the structure of organized crime, they were essentially studying him. When governments formed task forces to combat syndicates, they were responding to the framework he introduced. Luciano forced the world to evolve. Prosecutors had to learn new investigative techniques, from financial tracking to undercover operations. Intelligence agencies had to understand networks rather than individuals. The modern fight against organized crime was shaped by the systems Luciano left behind. His legacy also includes a deeper, more psychological component, the philosophy of quiet control. In a world that often rewards aggression, Luciano demonstrated that true power lies in subtlety. He taught that leaders do not need to dominate through force. They need to understand people, anticipate their actions, and create systems that guide behavior without constant intervention. This idea resonated not only in criminal circles but also in legitimate leadership strategies. The very concept of managing from the shadows, of influencing without appearing to command, has echoes of Luciano's approach. But perhaps the most fascinating part of his legacy is how it survives in contradiction. Luciano is remembered as both a villain and a visionary, a destroyer and a builder, a man whose empire was born from exploitation yet operated with an efficiency that even legitimate institutions envied. His story is a reminder that power is never simple. It is never pure. It is a force shaped by ambition, intelligence, circumstance, and the human flaws that drive men to seek control in the first place. In the years after his death, journalists, historians, criminologists, and filmmakers all attempted to make sense of his life. But Luciano remains elusive, impossible to fully categorize, impossible to fully condemn or admire without acknowledging the other half of the truth. He existed in the gray spaces between morality and necessity, between survival and dominance, between criminality and leadership. And it is in those gray spaces that his legacy continues to live. For the men who followed him, he became a model. For the institutions that opposed him, he became a lesson. For the public, he became a myth. And for history, he became a turning point, a moment when one man's vision reshaped an entire underground world. In the end, Luciano's legacy is not measured by the years he spent free, nor by the prison cell that held him, nor by the exile he endured. It is measured by the system he left behind, by the minds he influenced, and by the strange, enduring fascination the world still holds for him. He may have died far from the empire he crafted, but the echoes of his quiet control still ripple across continents, across decades, across the hidden corners of human ambition. His life proved that power can be silent, that influence can be invisible, and that a single mind, sharper, calmer, and more disciplined than the rest, can leave an imprint on history that refuses to fade. Lucky Luciano changed the underworld forever. And in doing so, he became a legend no prison, no exile, and no passage of time could erase. Every story eventually circles back to its beginning, not in the literal sense, but in the emotional truth that lies beneath it. Lucky Luciano's journey, from a young immigrant boy wandering the chaotic streets of the Lower East Side to the architect of the modern American Mafia, and finally to a lonely exile far from the city he once ruled, reveals a truth both unsettling and deeply human. Power is temporary, influence is fragile, and even the most formidable legends are still bound by the same fate as every other man. In the years since his death, countless narratives have tried to define him. Some portray him as a cold-blooded criminal, a mastermind who manipulated systems for personal gain. Others see him as a visionary, a strategist whose intelligence transformed a fragmented underworld into a structured empire. But all these portrayals, whether condemning or admiring, overlook the quiet complexity that shaped his life. Luciano was not a villain created by evil, nor a hero shaped by brilliance alone. He was a man navigating the storms of his time, shaped by poverty, sharpened by violence, and driven by a hunger for control in a world where survival often depended on it. As we look back at the arc of his existence, the contradictions stand at the forefront. He was ruthless yet diplomatic. He was feared yet strangely respected. He was a criminal, yet carried himself with the dignity of a statesman. He ruled an empire, yet died without a true home. These contradictions make his story compelling, not because they create mystery, but because they reflect the reality of human nature. Luciano embodied the darkness and the brilliance that coexist within ambition, showing how the same qualities that elevate a man can also bring about his downfall. In the end, he lived a life of extraordinary influence but suffered a fate defined by isolation. His years in Italy, though filled with moments of connection and flashes of old authority, were ultimately marked by exile, a punishment far more emotional than physical. For a man who spent his life shaping the movement of others, the inability to step foot in the country he had helped redefine was a wound that never healed. He could communicate, advise, observe, but he could not return. His world continued without him, slowly evolving into something he could no longer fully comprehend. Yet his mind remained sharp until the very end. In quiet cafes and dim apartments overlooking the Neapolitan coast, he spoke with visitors about the state of the underworld, offering insights that revealed a deep understanding not only of crime but of people. He knew why men sought power. He knew why they betrayed. He knew why they failed. And he understood more clearly than ever the cost of his own rise. For all the money, influence, and respect he accumulated, the price he paid was heavy, measured not in years lost to prison or exile, but in the relationships he sacrificed, the trust he could never fully offer, and the constant awareness that every ally carried the potential to become an enemy. This realization does not absolve him. It humanizes him. It shows that even the most controlled, calculated mind is not immune to regret. He lived by strategy, but he died with reflection. And that reflection is an essential part of understanding his legacy, not as myth but as a man. When he collapsed at the airport in 1962, it was a symbolic ending. He died in motion, caught between the world he once ruled and the world that had moved on without him. The man who spent his youth navigating the streets of Manhattan and his adulthood directing the currents of international crime left the world at a crossroads, poised between memory and myth. His body fell, but his story rose, carried by headlines, books, films, and the whispered admiration of generations of gangsters who studied his methods with reverence. But the final question remains, what does Luciano's life teach us? Perhaps it teaches that power rooted in fear collapses, but power rooted in structure endures. Perhaps it teaches that intelligence can build empires, but cannot prevent their decay. Perhaps it shows that a man can change the world around him and still be powerless to change the fate that waits for him at the end. Most of all, Luciano's life illustrates the paradox of leadership. The more control a man seeks, the more he must sacrifice to maintain it. He gained influence by mastering silence, by reading the subtleties of human behavior, by shaping systems instead of individual moments. Yet those same systems eventually outgrew him, leaving him a spectator to the very forces he once commanded. There is a haunting beauty in that reality. The architect of the American Mafia spent his final years watching that world evolve from afar, unable to direct its path but forever responsible for its foundation. His contribution could not be erased. The commission, the structure of the families, the businesslike approach to crime, all of it carried traces of his mind. And even when the Mafia faced internal collapse decades later, scholars and law enforcement alike continued to cite Luciano as the root of its modern form. But beyond structure and strategy, there is something deeper, the emotional truth of his journey. Luciano's rise was fueled by a desire for security born from poverty, for control born from chaos, for identity born from displacement. His intelligence sharpened his rise, but his fear of vulnerability accelerated it. In a world where a wrong glance could lead to death, Luciano learned to eliminate uncertainty by becoming the force others feared to cross. That instinct shaped him, defined him, and ultimately cornered him. To maintain control, he had to embrace secrecy. To maintain influence, he had to foster mistrust. To maintain power, he had to deny fragility. And so, by the end of his life, Luciano existed as a paradox. A man surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. Still, he left behind a lesson that extends beyond crime. His story reveals the power of structure, the necessity of adaptation, and the weight of leadership. It shows how ambition can inspire greatness but also create prisons of its own. And it reminds us that the world's most influential figures are often shaped by the same fears, desires, and insecurities that shape ordinary people. In this final reflection, what remains is not the criminal acts, nor the trials, nor the headlines that once defined him. What remains is the echo of a man who understood power in ways few ever do. A man who mastered silence, who built an empire with strategy instead of chaos, who proved that the loudest voice is not always the strongest. His influence still pulses in the stories we tell about the Mafia, in the way we imagine organized crime, and even in the leadership models adopted in entirely different worlds. Lucky Luciano did not simply participate in history, he redirected it. And though he lived a life shrouded in secrecy and contradiction, his impact is undeniably clear. His story endures because it speaks to the complexities of human ambition, the shadows of power, and the duality of a man who could rule without fear but could not escape the consequences of ruling at all. In the end, the myth and the man blend into one. His voice is gone, but his silence remains. His empire has changed, but the blueprint he drew continues to influence. His life has ended, but his legend, whispered in backrooms, written in history books and portrayed on screens, lives on. Lucky Luciano's journey began in poverty, rose through violence, flourished through intellect, and ended in exile. But his legacy, shaped by quiet control and unwavering strategy, refuses to fade. He left the world as he lived in it, calm, controlled, and unforgettable.